The 6:47 p.m. express train jolted to a stop at Harbor Street Station, and Maya gripped the metal pole with both hands to keep from tumbling into the businessman beside her. The commuter crush during rush hour was suffocating. Bodies pressed against bodies, the air thick with the mingled scents of perfume, coffee, and exhaustion. She'd been standing for the last 4 stops, having given up her seat to an elderly woman, 3 stations back, and her feet throbbed in her worn canvas sneakers. Through the grimy window, she could see the sun bleeding orange across the city skyline, and somewhere in that golden hour existed her 2 jobs, her night classes, and the life she was desperately trying to build from nothing. A man stumbled into the car as the doors hissed open, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Maya's monthly rent. He moved with the weariness of someone carrying the weight of the world. His sharp gray eyes dulled with fatigue, and he gripped the overhead rail with a trembling hand. Maya watched as the other passengers seemed to look through him, wrapped in their phones and their own small dramas. The train lurched forward, and the man's knees buckled slightly. Without thinking, without hesitation, Maya stood up from the only seat she'd managed to snag 2 stops ago and gestured to the empty space behind her. "Please," she said simply, "sit down." The man looked at her with an expression of utter surprise, as if kindness from a stranger had become such a foreign concept that he'd forgotten what it looked like. He was too tired to refuse. "Thank you," he murmured, lowering himself into the seat with visible relief, and Maya turned away, gripping the pole again, her legs already aching. She had no idea that this single moment, this small, unremarkable act of compassion, would alter the entire trajectory of her life and the lives of everyone she loved. She had no idea that the man sitting in her vacated seat was Harrison Wells, the 68-year-old CEO of Wells and Associates, a conglomerate worth $4 billion, and that he was having the worst day of his extraordinarily privileged existence. She had no idea that he was desperately searching for something that money couldn't buy, something that had become rarer and more valuable than any asset on his balance sheet. She only knew that her feet hurt, that she had a shift starting at 8 o'clock, and that kindness was the one currency she would always have enough of to give away. For the next 20 minutes, Maya tried not to think about how exhausted she was. The train rattled through the city's arteries, past the gleaming financial district, where men and women in suits far nicer than hers conducted billion-dollar deals, past the renovated neighborhoods, where young professionals paid premium prices for authenticity, past the older sections of the city, where people like her lived and worked and dreamed in small apartments with water-stained ceilings and radiators that clanked all night long. Her shift at the restaurant started in less than an hour, and before that she needed to change into her uniform and grab a protein bar from the corner store if she could find one on sale. She'd worked at the Golden Fork since she was 17, 5 years now, and her manager had recently promoted her to lead server on weekend nights, which meant better tips and more hours. The money was crucial. Her mother, Elena, had been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis 2 years ago, and the medical bills had decimated what little savings their family had accumulated. Maya worked 2 jobs to cover her mother's medications and physical therapy, and she attended community college at night, determined to graduate with a degree in business management. She wanted to build something, to create a life where her mother wouldn't have to worry anymore. where they could afford a better apartment, where the constant anxiety about money wouldn't shadow every decision. The man in the blue suit, she still didn't know his name, stared out the window with the intensity of someone watching their life pass before their eyes. He'd been staring in that direction for the past 18 minutes, and he hadn't moved once, except to shift his weight slightly as the train navigated a curve. Maya tried not to look at him, tried to focus on the text message from her roommate, Sophie, asking if she could pick up oat milk on her way home. But something about his expression nagged at her. It wasn't the exhaustion of a long workday, though he clearly had one of those. It was something deeper, a kind of spiritual weariness that transcended mere physical fatigue. Harrison Wells was sitting in a seat given to him by a girl who didn't know who he was, and that fact alone felt like a small miracle. He'd spent so much of his life being recognized, accommodated, catered to because of who he was and what he represented. Servers rushed to his table at upscale restaurants. Colleagues deferred to his opinions. His foundation, which gave away millions annually, attracted a certain kind of fawning gratitude that always felt hollow. But this girl, with her paint-stained sneakers and her work backpack covered in pins and patches, she'd given him her seat, not because she knew he was worth $4 billion, but because he looked tired, because he was another human being who needed to sit down. The simplicity and purity of that act had shaken something loose in him. For the past 6 months, Harrison had been in a state of quiet crisis that none of his business associates could detect. Outwardly, he remained the consummate professional, making decisions, attending board meetings, reviewing quarterly reports. But internally, he was hollow. His company was thriving, his wealth was increasing, his philanthropic efforts were recognized globally, and yet he felt like a man slowly suffocating in luxury. He'd been married for 43 years to Margaret, but she'd become something of a stranger to him. Their shared life reduced to coordinating schedules and attending charity galas, where they played the role of the power couple. Their 2 adult children had their own lives and their own struggles that money couldn't solve. His grandchildren barely knew him. He'd worked so relentlessly to build his empire that he'd forgotten to build anything that mattered. Just that morning, he'd received his latest medical checkup, and his doctor had delivered the kind of lecture that wealthy men often dismiss as the concerns of lesser mortals. Your blood pressure is dangerously high. You need to slow down. You need rest. You need meaning. The last word had stuck with him like a splinter. Meaning, as if meaning were something a man of his stature needed to seek out, as if it weren't automatically conferred upon someone of his importance and resources. The train pulled into the next station, and several passengers got off. A teenage boy with a skateboard, a woman with a crying toddler, an elderly couple holding hands despite their weathered appearance. New passengers boarded, more of the same urban ballet that played out thousands of times daily on this line. Harrison watched the girl, for he could see now that she was very much a girl, probably not more than 22 or 23. Grip the pole with the posture of someone whose body had become an instrument for endurance. Her hands were small, and there was a callus on her thumb that suggested she wrote constantly or played an instrument. Her face was plain, in the way that young faces often are when they're not staged for Instagram, and there was something almost luminous about the lack of pretense. No makeup to hide behind. no affectation in her movements. Just a young woman, tired, and working, and existing in the world without demanding that the world owe her anything. He found himself wondering what her story was. Where was she going? What burden did she carry? Did she have people who loved her? Was she struggling as well? Or was this just the ordinary exhaustion of urban existence? When the train pulled into the stop at 5th and Main, Maya gathered her things. "Excuse me," she murmured to the people standing between her and the door, and they shifted to let her through. She didn't look back at the man in the blue suit, didn't expect acknowledgement or thanks. Kindness wasn't a transaction. She didn't perform it with the expectation of return. She performed it because her mother had raised her to see the world through a lens of compassion, because her childhood had taught her that all of us are just doing our best, and because she believed, perhaps naively, that goodness mattered. The train doors hissed open, and she stepped out onto the platform, immediately accelerating her pace toward the stairs. The Golden Fork was 8 blocks away, and she could make it in 12 minutes if she walked quickly without running. Running looked desperate, and she tried never to look desperate, even when she was. Harrison watched her disappear into the crowd of exiting passengers, and something inside him crystallized into certainty. He needed to know her name. He needed to understand what had motivated her to give up her seat. He needed to experience more of whatever she represented. Authenticity, kindness, presence, the things he'd spent 68 years accumulating everything except. Without allowing himself to overthink the impulse, he stood up and followed her off the train. The evening air hit him with the shock of transition, from the recycled staleness of the car to the humid warmth of the September night. The city assaulted the senses with its particular energy. The rumble of traffic, the smell of grilled food from street vendors, the overlapping conversations of thousands of people moving through their personal narratives. Harrison, who rarely walked anywhere anymore, he was driven by his driver or flown by helicopter, found himself slightly disoriented by the democracy of the sidewalk. People didn't defer to him here. A woman in a purple coat actually bumped into him without apologizing. A delivery cyclist nearly clipped his arm. A group of teenagers took up the entire width of the sidewalk, forcing others to navigate around them. It was marvelous and terrifying in equal measure. He spotted her half a block ahead, moving with the particular urgency of someone running late, and he increased his pace. "Excuse me," he called out, but his voice was lost in the ambient noise. He tried again, louder. "Young lady." Maya heard something behind her, a voice that didn't quite belong to the regular symphony of the city. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the man from the train, the one she'd given her seat to, hurrying after her with the determination of someone pursuing something important. Her first instinct was alarm. Solo women traveling through the city at dusk learned quickly that unexpected attention from strange men was rarely benign. But something in his expression, a kind of earnest confusion, as if he himself didn't quite understand why he was doing this, seemed unthreatening. She slowed her pace slightly, and he caught up to her, breathing heavily. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know this is strange. I wanted to thank you properly for your kindness on the train. You gave me your seat, and it meant something." Maya felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. This was just a nice older man, perhaps a bit lonely, wanting to acknowledge a small kindness. She'd encountered his type before, people who seemed surprised by basic human decency, as if the world had become so transactional that a single act of unconditional generosity registered as shocking. "You're welcome," she said, and she meant to walk away, to excuse herself and get to work. But something in his eyes stopped her. There was a quality of searching in them, of real need, not the performative neediness of people who'd never been denied anything. "It wasn't a big deal. You look tired." "I am tired," he said, and then with a wry smile that made him look almost boyish despite his obvious age. "I'm tired in ways that sleep won't fix. But that's not your burden. I just wanted to introduce myself properly. Harrison Wells." He extended his hand. Maya shook it, and his grip was warm and surprisingly gentle. "Maya Flores. And I really do need to get going. I have a shift at a restaurant just a few blocks from here." "The Golden Fork?" he asked, and she looked at him in surprise. How could he possibly know that? "I eat there occasionally when I want to remember what real food tastes like, not the molecular gastronomy nonsense the hotels serve." "Is that where you're headed?" "Yes," Maya said slowly. Do I know you from there?" "Not directly, but I notice things. I notice that it's one of the few restaurants in this city where the servers actually seem to care about the customer's experience rather than performing care. I've been meaning to go back." He glanced at his watch, a piece of hardware that probably cost more than Maya's monthly rent. "I have some time. Would you mind if I accompanied you?" "If you'd allow it, of course. I have no intention of being creepy or inappropriate. I simply find myself genuinely interested in your story." Maya's instinct told her this was unusual, but her instinct also told her that Harrison Wells, assuming that was his real name, and something told her it was not a threat. Besides, they were walking in broad daylight through a densely populated area, and if anything strange happened, she was literally heading to her workplace, where she could easily summon help. "Okay," she said, "but fair warning, I'm not very interesting. I'm a server and a student, not much of a story." "I doubt that," Harrison said, and they began walking together through the early evening city. As they walked, something remarkable happened. Despite the enormous gulf between them, in terms of age, wealth, education, and life experience, they fell into an easy conversation. Maya told him about her mother's illness, about working 2 jobs to afford her mother's medications, about the night classes she attended 3 times a week, about her dreams of opening her own restaurant someday. She spoke without self-pity or seeking sympathy, presenting her circumstances as simply the facts of her life, the shape of her particular reality. Harrison, in turn, found himself sharing things he rarely spoke aloud. He talked about the hollowness of success, about the way that accumulating wealth had actually decreased his sense of abundance, about the strange loneliness of being so rich that everyone around you wanted something from you. He talked about his failing marriage, about his distant relationship with his children, about the guilt that had been accumulating like sediment at the bottom of his consciousness. By the time they reached the Golden Fork, they'd created something unusual, a genuine connection that transcended the conventional barriers of their circumstances. "This is me," Maya said as they arrived at the restaurant's modest entrance. The storefront was small and unassuming, with a warm yellow glow emanating from the windows and the smell of cilantro and garlic and cumin spilling out onto the street. Through the glass they could see the modest dining room, already filling with the dinner crowd, a mix of neighborhood regulars and curious newcomers, seeking authentic food at reasonable prices. "Thanks for walking me. That was nice." "Thank you for allowing me to," Harrison said. And then before he could second-guess himself, he added, "I'd like to take you and your mother to dinner sometime. A proper dinner, somewhere special. Would that be acceptable to you?" Maya hesitated. This was stepping over a line she couldn't quite identify, entering into territory that felt complicated and potentially fraught. But she also recognized that this man was offering something that wasn't about money or status. He was offering genuine connection, the kind of thing that couldn't be bought or manufactured. And her mother had been so exhausted lately, carrying both her illness and the weight of Maya's sacrifices. A nice dinner would be wonderful for her. "My mom would love that," Maya said finally. "Honestly, I think she would love it. She hasn't had anyone take her anywhere in a long time." "Saturday?" he asked. "Could I pick you both up at 7 o'clock?" Maya gave him her address and phone number, and they exchanged these pieces of information with the solemnity of people conducting something significant, even if neither of them could quite articulate why. Then she turned and walked into the restaurant, and Harrison stood outside for a moment, watching her disappear into her world of work and service and exhaustion, and something inside him felt like it was finally beginning to align. Work that night was particularly busy. Friday nights at the Golden Fork were always intense. Every table full, a line of people waiting outside despite the walk-in weather, the kitchen firing on all cylinders to keep up with the demand. Maya moved through the chaos with the grace of someone who'd done this thousands of times, taking orders, clearing plates, refilling water glasses, and reading her customers with the instinct that separated good servers from great ones. She knew which couple, celebrating their anniversary, wanted to linger over their food, and which businessman was checking his watch and mentally calculating whether he had time to make his next meeting. She anticipated needs before they were expressed. She navigated between tables with the precision of someone who understood the physics of crowded restaurant space. By the time her shift ended at 11 o'clock, her feet were screaming and her back was aching, but she'd made decent tips, and the satisfaction of a well-executed service still lingered in her veins. She took the bus home, too tired to walk despite the pleasant evening, and found Sophie already asleep on the couch with the television murmuring softly in the background. Their apartment was the kind of place that only made sense as a temporary situation, despite the fact that they'd both lived there for 3 years. The walls were thin enough to hear their neighbors arguing in Spanish or watching Korean dramas. The kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people to stand in simultaneously. The bathroom had a tendency toward mold in the corners, no matter how often they cleaned it. But it was theirs, and they'd made it a home as much as they could, decorating the walls with prints from thrift stores and hanging plants that struggled to survive in the limited light. Maya pushed Sophie's feet over and collapsed onto the couch beside her roommate, her body already beginning its nightly shutdown toward sleep. When she got home the next morning from her Saturday shift at the coffee shop where she worked from 5 to noon, there was a message on her phone from an unknown number. She almost deleted it without listening, but something made her open it instead. "Hi, Maya. This is Harrison Wells. We met on the train yesterday evening. I'm very much looking forward to Saturday dinner with you and your mother." I've made reservations at Lumiere, if that's acceptable. I'll pick you up at 7. Thank you again for your kindness." His voice on the voicemail was warm and genuinely kind, and it struck her that he'd actually called rather than texted, which felt like something an older generation would do, something almost formal and courteous in a way that had become rare. She called him back after making coffee, and they talked for exactly 7 minutes before Maya had to go help her mother with her physical therapy exercises. In those 7 minutes, Harrison told her that he'd decided to make some changes in his life, that meeting her had clarified something important about his priorities, that he was grateful for her willingness to let him know her. Maya found herself genuinely liking him, though she was careful to maintain some emotional distance. She'd seen enough movies and heard enough cautionary tales to know that the world was full of people with hidden intentions. But she also recognized that sometimes people were simply kind, simply lonely, simply reaching out for connection with no ulterior motive beyond the desire not to feel so alone. Saturday arrived with the kind of weather that felt like late summer pretending to be early autumn. Warm and golden and full of possibility. Maya spent the afternoon helping her mother prepare, something that involved far more than just selecting an outfit. Her mother, Elena, had bad days and good days, and today was one of the better ones. The medication schedule was calibrated such that by evening she would have maximum mobility and minimum pain. They'd been managing her rheumatoid arthritis for 2 years now, and they'd learned to time everything around the fluctuations of her condition. Elena was a beautiful woman in her early 60s, with silver-threaded dark hair that she wore long despite society's suggestions that women of her age should adopt something more appropriate. She had Maya's eyes, but with a deeper wisdom behind them, the wisdom of someone who'd survived actual hardship, immigrating to this country with nothing, raising 2 children as a single mother after their father's accident, building a life with the resources available to her. "Why do you think this man wants to take us to dinner?" Elena asked as she carefully applied lipstick in the bathroom mirror, favoring her left side because the right side of her mouth didn't quite move the way it used to due to inflammation. "What does he want from you?" "I think he just wants to be kind, Mommy," Maya said, standing in the doorway, watching her mother with the bittersweet mixture of emotions she often experienced when witnessing her mother's daily struggles. He seemed lonely. Sometimes I think rich people can be the loneliest people in the world. Rich people have their own problems, Elena agreed. But those problems are different from ours. Remember that. Don't get confused about what we have and what they have. We have each other. We have health, mostly. We have time together. Those are the expensive things, the things they often don't have. By 6:55, they were ready. Maya wore a simple black dress that she'd found at a thrift store for $8 and had had tailored by her aunt. Elena wore a deep blue dress that made her dark eyes luminous. When the intercom buzzed at exactly 7 o'clock, they exchanged a look that was part excitement and part apprehension, and Maya pressed the button to let Harrison in. He arrived at their door carrying flowers, white lilies, and when Elena opened the door and saw him, something in her expression shifted. It was subtle, just a slight widening of the eyes, a barely perceptible intake of breath. She recognized him, Maya realized. Not personally, but perhaps from media coverage, from television, from the kind of cultural currency that even people without much contact with the wealthy world still absorbed. Elena said nothing, but she accepted the flowers graciously and allowed Harrison to compliment her appearance without seeming to take the words at face value. This was Elena's particular skill, the ability to receive kindness while maintaining her own dignity and autonomy. Lumiere was exactly the kind of restaurant Maya had read about in magazine articles, but never dreamed of actually experiencing. It occupied the entire 38th floor of the Sterling building, and the windows provided an absolutely breathtaking view of the city at dusk. The staff recognized Harrison immediately and moved with the kind of efficiency that came from long practice in serving the powerful and wealthy. They were seated at a corner table with the best view, and the sommelier appeared within seconds to discuss wine options. Elena, who drank wine rarely and without much sophistication, ordered a simple Pinot Grigio. Harrison chose a Burgundy that cost more than Maya's weekly grocery budget. Maya ordered a white wine that fell somewhere in between, determined not to be intimidated by the logistics of expensive dining. The food was extraordinary in the way that only food prepared by truly talented chefs could be. The courses arrived in a choreography of service, small bites designed to prepare the palate for the next sensation, foams and reductions, and cuts of meat so tender that they dissolved on the tongue. Vegetables transformed into something almost unrecognizable, but somehow more themselves. It was the kind of meal that required attention and intention, and they ate slowly, savoring each bite, and the conversation that wove around and through the experience of eating. Harrison asked Elena about her immigration story, about what had brought her to this country, and Elena told him, in her careful English, that she'd come when she was 22, with a high school diploma and a job lined up at a garment factory. She'd worked nights and attended English classes during the day. She'd met Maya's father at a community center dance, and they'd married after dating for 6 months, because they'd both understood that marriage was a practical arrangement that they'd hopefully grow to love. And they had, she said, until his accident when Maya was 4. A construction site, a miscalculation, a moment that changed everything. She'd been widowed at 31 and had worked 2 jobs herself for years to keep her children fed and housed and educated. She talked about this without bitterness, presenting her life as a series of facts that had to be managed rather than as a tragedy to be lamented. "You're an extraordinary woman," Harrison said, and something in the way he said it suggested that he meant it not as flattery, but as observation. "Your daughter clearly inherited her kindness from you." "She inherited her hard work from me," Elena corrected gently. "But her kindness comes from her own spirit. I taught her survival. She teaches herself generosity. That's a choice she makes every day, and it's more valuable than anything I could have given her." As the evening progressed, Maya found herself relaxing into a kind of comfort with Harrison. He wasn't trying to be anyone but himself, an older man who'd lived a life of privilege, but who was now genuinely questioning what that privilege had meant. He was funny, in an understated way, and he listened more than he spoke, which was increasingly rare in Maya's experience. He paid attention to the details of what people said, and he asked follow-up questions that suggested genuine curiosity rather than perfunctory politeness. "I'm going to be honest with you both," he said as they waited for dessert to arrive, "and I hope you'll forgive me if I'm being too forward." Seeing you two tonight, listening to your stories, remembering where I came from. My father was a carpenter, and my mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. I realize that I've spent my entire adult life running away from who I am. I've been accumulating things and accolades and status, and I haven't been accumulating anything real. Meeting Maya on the train yesterday was like the universe giving me a wake-up call that I needed to hear. "What do you want to do?" Maya asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't asking the question to be polite. She was genuinely interested in his answer. "I'm not entirely sure yet," Harrison admitted, "but I know that I want to change. I want to be more present. I want to understand what it means to actually be alive, rather than just moving through the motions of a high-status life. I want to reconnect with what matters." Elena, who had been quiet for a moment, reached across the table and patted his hand. "That's very good," she said. "But be careful. When you start to change, many people will resist. They've become accustomed to who you were, and they will want to keep you that way because it makes them feel safe. You have to be strong enough to disappoint people you love in order to become yourself." The wisdom in that statement seemed to land heavily on Harrison, and Maya watched as something shifted in his face. The recognition that Elena had just given him permission to do something he'd been afraid to do, to change in ways that would be uncomfortable and costly. The drive home was quiet and contemplative. Harrison drove them himself rather than calling his driver, and there was something intimate about the three of them in the car together as they moved through the city toward the neighborhood where Maya and Elena lived. When they arrived at their building, Harrison walked them to the door. "Thank you for one of the most meaningful evenings I've had in years," he said, and he meant it. "I would very much like to do this again, if you're willing." "We would like that," Elena said, and she extended her hand to shake his, which was a generous gesture considering her usual reserve with strangers. "But next time you come to our house, you eat my cooking. My daughter tells me that I make the best mofongo in 3 states, and I want to know if a man with such refined tastes can appreciate the food of my childhood." After Harrison left, Elena sat down on their worn sofa with a sigh. "He's a good man," she said, "but he's a man in pain. You see how sad his eyes are, even when he smiles? That's the sadness of someone who knows they've wasted time. Be careful with him, my daughter. Kindness can sometimes attract people who want to use your kindness to heal themselves, and that's not a burden you should carry." "I know, Mommy," Maya said, and she did know. She'd always been careful about the line between compassion and responsibility. But something told her that this connection with Harrison was significant in a way that transcended the usual boundaries of relationship. Over the next 2 months, a kind of friendship developed between them. Harrison became a regular presence in their lives. Dinner at their apartment once a week, where Elena would cook elaborate meals that transported them all to Santo Domingo for an evening. He would bring flowers and wine, and he would sit at their small kitchen table and help chop vegetables while Elena narrated the stories of her childhood. He attended one of Maya's night classes, a business management seminar, and sat in the back of the room, and afterward he and Maya and the professor had drinks and discussed the ideas that had been presented. He learned about Maya's dream of opening a restaurant, and he asked detailed questions about her business plans and her thoughts about location and cuisine and the market she wanted to serve. What was remarkable was how genuine this friendship became. There was no performance to it, no hidden agenda. Harrison wasn't trying to buy his way into their lives with expensive gifts or extravagant gestures. He was simply present, and his presence was a gift in itself. He told them stories about his own life that revealed his vulnerabilities. He talked about his marriage, which had become irreparably distant, and his children, who barely knew him, and his business, which he was beginning to question whether he even wanted to continue running. He talked about the existential crisis of being 68 years old and realizing that he'd built an empire but hadn't actually lived a life. Elena seemed to understand him in a way that transcended their obvious differences. She would listen to his stories with the patient attention of someone who'd heard many stories of human suffering and survival, and she would offer observations that were both practical and deeply wise. "You can't go backward," she told him one evening when he was lamenting the years he'd wasted. "You can only go forward. So the question is not, what did I waste, but what will I do with the time I have left? That's always the real question." It was during one of these regular dinners that Harrison first broached the subject that had been occupying his thoughts. He'd finished Elena's arroz con pollo and was on his second glass of wine, and Maya was studying for an upcoming exam, her laptop open on the kitchen table while adults spoke around her. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about my legacy, not the empire that will likely implode or transform or whatever it will do, but my actual legacy, the mark I want to leave on the world." He paused, and Elena waited for him to continue, knowing that he was working towards something important. "I want to create a foundation specifically for young people like Maya, for people who are working hard and studying hard and dreaming of creating their own businesses, but who lack the capital and the connections to make it happen. I want to create a program that provides both financial support and mentorship." "Why?" Elena asked, not skeptically, but genuinely. "Why this?" "Because," Harrison said, "meeting Maya showed me that there are people in this world who are doing everything right, working multiple jobs, studying, maintaining their humanity and kindness despite the exhaustion, and they're still struggling. Because I have resources that I don't actually need, and the world has people with talent and determination who do need them. Because it would give my life a sense of purpose that accumulating more money never could. Because I think this might be what meaning actually looks like." Over the following weeks and months, the foundation took shape. Harrison hired lawyers and accountants and business consultants. He worked with educational institutions to create a program that would identify promising young entrepreneurs and provide them with grants, low-interest loans, and mentorship from successful business people. He was careful to design the program in a way that didn't create dependency or obligation, but rather enabled people to pursue their own vision with support rather than with charity. But what was perhaps more significant was the personal transformation that Harrison underwent. He began spending less time at the office and more time involved in the foundation. He hired a new CEO for Wells and Associates and stepped back from day-to-day operations. He initiated conversations with his wife about their marriage, difficult conversations that ultimately led to a mutual agreement to separate amicably and eventually to divorce. It was not easy, and there were moments of real grief and regret. But both Margaret and Harrison came to understand that their life together had become a performance rather than an authentic partnership. He bought a small apartment in the same neighborhood where Maya and Elena lived, claiming that he wanted to be more connected to the community where the Foundation's work would primarily focus. But everyone understood that he wanted to be near them, near Elena, who had become like the mother he'd needed to know he wanted, near Maya, who represented the possibility of redemption and meaning that had seemed so elusive for so long. Maya's own life began to transform as well, though in a more subtle way. She received one of the Foundation's first grants, a substantial amount of money specifically designed for restaurant entrepreneurs. Combined with her own savings and a small business loan, it gave her enough capital to pursue the dream that had seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. She found a small space in the neighborhood, a former laundromat that had been closed for 2 years and was available at a price she could actually afford. With Harrison's mentorship and her own relentless work ethic, she developed a detailed business plan. She called the restaurant Lumiere, as a nod to that first extraordinary dinner, and also as a statement about bringing light to her neighborhood in the way that good food and genuine hospitality could. The opening of Lumiere happened on a Thursday evening in November, 16 months after Maya had given her seat to a tired man on a train. The space was modest but beautiful. Exposed brick walls, warm lighting, simple wooden tables, and an open kitchen where customers could watch the food being prepared. Elena, who'd finally been fitted with enough medication to manage her pain with relative effectiveness, worked alongside her daughter through the opening rush. The neighborhood had been waiting for a place like this, a restaurant that served food that was authentic and delicious and affordable, where people were welcomed as family rather than treated as transactions. Harrison attended the opening, of course, and he sat at his usual table in the corner where he could see everything. He watched Maya move through her restaurant with the grace and efficiency of someone who'd found exactly where they belonged. He watched Elena supervise the kitchen, occasionally stepping in to adjust a recipe or encourage a nervous prep cook. He watched the neighborhood residents, the people who worked in the businesses nearby, the students from the community college, the elderly couples, and young families and solo diners, all finding sustenance and connection in this space that hadn't existed before. At the end of the night, after the last customer had left and the cleaning was done, Elena and Maya and Harrison sat at one of the tables with glasses of wine, exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. "You did it," Harrison said, and there was genuine pride and joy in his voice. "You actually did it." "We did it," Maya corrected, gesturing to include all 3 of them. "You gave me the tools, the Foundation gave me the money, and Mommy gave me everything I am. I couldn't have done this alone." "None of us can," Elena said quietly. "That's the thing nobody tells you when you're young and struggling. We think we have to do everything alone, that accepting help is weakness. But the truth is that all the greatest things are created together. The businesses, the families, the communities, the beautiful things we make, all of it requires cooperation and vulnerability and the willingness to need each other." Harrison listened to this wisdom and felt something settle inside him, a sense of peace that had eluded him for decades. He'd spent so long believing that needing others was a kind of failure, that the greatest achievement was absolute self-sufficiency. But sitting at this table, in this modest restaurant, surrounded by two women who'd shown him kindness without ever asking what he could do for them in return, he understood that his greatest strength had come from learning to receive, from allowing himself to be transformed by connection. The weeks and months that followed revealed the ripple effects of that single moment of kindness on a train. Maya's restaurant became known throughout the city as a place where neighborhood residents felt genuinely valued, where the food was rooted in authentic tradition, but was also innovative and exciting. She hired young people from the community, students, people without formal restaurant experience, people who needed a chance, and she trained them with patience and generosity. Several of them would go on to open their own establishments, carrying forward the same philosophy of hospitality and community that Elena had instilled in her daughter. The foundation that Harrison created processed its first class of young entrepreneurs through the program, and the results exceeded even his optimistic projections. Of the 25 recipients of the initial grants, all but 2 successfully launched their businesses within 2 years. An engineering student opened a mobile phone repair service. An artist developed a line of sustainable home goods. A nurse created a home healthcare company specifically designed to serve elderly immigrants. A single mother opened a child care center. A musician started a music school. Each of these businesses became another point of light in the neighborhood, another example of individual dreams becoming reality through combination of personal determination and structural support. Harrison began writing about his journey, documenting not in the polished language of a memoir, but in the honest, sometimes fractured way that a man discovering truth late in life actually experiences it. His articles, published in business journals and mainstream magazines, sparked conversations about corporate responsibility, about what it actually means to create lasting value, about the hidden crisis of meaning among the wealthy. Some in his circles dismissed his transformation as a kind of celebrity redemption arc, the performative pivot of a man concerned about his legacy. But those who knew him recognized the authenticity of his change. He was not performing kindness, he was living it. Maya's mother, Elena, became an unexpected mentor figure in the Foundations program as well. Harrison, recognizing her wisdom and her ability to connect with people, asked if she would consider working with the Foundation in an advisory capacity, not as an employee, but as someone who could help identify promising candidates and provide guidance grounded in real-world experience of struggle and survival. Elena, who'd spent most of her life underestimated and overlooked despite her obvious intelligence, finally found a platform for her gifts. She would meet with grant recipients and listen to their ideas, and with a few simple questions and observations, she could often identify what was missing in their thinking, or what assumptions they'd made that needed challenging. The most successful people, she would tell the young entrepreneurs who sat across from her in the Foundation's modest offices, are not the ones with the best ideas. They're the ones with the best ability to adapt. You have to be willing to hear no and understand that it doesn't mean you're wrong. It might just mean you need to approach it differently. The other thing is community. Every single successful business is successful because people chose to support it. Never think you're building something alone. You're building something with the people around you, whether they know it or not. Respect that. Honor that. 2 years after the opening of Lumiere, Maya was approached by a publisher, interested in creating a cookbook. Not just recipes, but a book that told the story of her mother's cooking, of the traditions that had been passed down through generations, of the way that food connects us to identity and history and place. Maya was initially hesitant. She was building a business. She didn't have time to write a book, but Elena encouraged her. "Your grandmother's recipes are dying with us," Elena said gently. "They're not written down anywhere. They exist only in my memory and in my hands. If you document them, if you share them, then they become immortal. That's a different kind of legacy than any restaurant could be." The cookbook, titled Light and Comfort, Dominican Traditions in My Mother's Kitchen, became an unexpected bestseller. It wasn't a glossy, professionally photographed manual of technique. It was a deeply personal book, with the recipes interspersed with the stories of Elena's childhood in Santo Domingo, her immigration journey, the ways that food had sustained her family through crisis, and the understanding that cooking was ultimately an expression of love. The book won a James Beard Award and brought Maya opportunities to write about food and culture for major publications. She became a voice in important conversations about food justice, about the way that immigrant cuisines were often appropriated and undervalued, about the politics of eating and what it means to honor the traditions that sustain us. But despite the success, despite the growing recognition and the expanding reach of her influence, Maya remained fundamentally grounded in the work of her restaurant. She continued to be present in the dining room most nights, greeting customers, listening to their feedback, ensuring that the experience aligned with her vision. She was the same woman who'd given her seat to a tired man on a train, generous, attentive, unwilling to let success create distance between her and the people she served. Harrison, watching all of this unfold, experienced a kind of quiet joy that he'd never felt before. He'd accumulated so many things in his life: money, power, status, possessions, but none of them had brought him the satisfaction he felt now, seeing the young entrepreneur he'd mentored on her way to giving a TED Talk about building community through food. He found himself less interested in the grand gestures and more interested in the small moments, having breakfast with Elena and discussing a particular recipe, sitting with Maya after closing to talk through a challenge she was facing with her business, meeting with a young woman who'd just received her first grant from the foundation and was terrified about what came next. In the 3rd year after they'd met, Harrison suffered a cardiac event. Nothing catastrophic, but significant enough to warrant hospitalization and a period of recovery. The doctors called it a warning, a reminder that even people who'd made peace with their mortality still had to contend with the physical realities of aging. He spent a week in the hospital, and Elena and Maya visited him every day. Elena brought him her cooking despite the hospital rules, tucking containers of carefully prepared meals into her large purse. Maya sat beside his bed and read to him, first business books and articles, then eventually novels, recognizing that he needed stories as much as he needed information. On the day he was discharged, Harrison made a decision that surprised everyone except himself. He resigned from the board of Wells and Associates entirely, severing his last formal connection to the empire he'd spent decades building. "The company doesn't need me," he told Maya and Elena as they drove him back to his apartment. "It hasn't needed me for months, and I don't need it. That part of my life served its purpose, and now I'm ready for something different." "What are you going to do?" Maya asked, genuinely curious about what came next for a man who'd redefined himself once already. "I'm going to write more," Harrison said. "I'm going to work full-time with the foundation. I'm going to spend time with people I love. I'm going to travel. Maybe. Your mother has told me stories about Santo Domingo for 3 years, and I want to see the place that shaped her. I want to understand where you come from, Maya. I want to know the world better than I've known it, and I want to keep learning." He paused, and then added, "I want to be useful, not in the way I was useful before, making deals, generating profit, but in the way that matters, by being present, by sharing what I've learned, by helping others avoid the mistakes I made." That summer, the three of them traveled together to Santo Domingo. Harrison had never left North America, except for a few golf trips to exclusive Caribbean resorts, and visiting the actual Caribbean with Elena as his guide was revelatory. She took him to the neighborhood where she'd grown up, to the house where her mother had lived, to the markets where she'd bought produce as a child, to the church where she'd been baptized. She introduced him to her extended family, cousins and aunts and uncles who'd known about the famous American businessman she'd become friends with, but who treated him with complete ordinariness, which he found profoundly moving. They fed him food that had never been meant for tourists, and they told him stories about Elena that revealed dimensions of her character that even Maya hadn't known. She'd been wild as a young woman, adventurous and rebellious. She'd been in love with someone else before Maya's father, a love that had ended in heartbreak that she'd never completely overcome. She'd wanted to study architecture, but there hadn't been money. She'd dreamed of traveling the world, but had instead devoted her life to her children. Hearing these stories, Harrison began to understand that Elena's wisdom hadn't come from accepting limitation, but from transcending it through consciousness and choice. She'd been limited by circumstance and economics, but she hadn't been limited in her thinking or her spirit. She'd created a full and meaningful life, not because she had access to unlimited possibility, but because she was intentional about how she allocated her finite resources of time and energy and attention. When they returned to the city, Harrison felt changed again, not in a dramatic way, but fundamentally. He'd begun his journey by recognizing the emptiness of accumulation, but now he was understanding the richness of authentic connection. And more than that, he was understanding that authentic connection wasn't something reserved for the wealthy or the privileged. It was available to anyone willing to pay attention, to show up, to truly listen. The foundation continued to grow, but Harrison made a deliberate choice to keep it modest. He refused the pressure from his financial advisors to expand the program to multiple cities and eventually nationwide. "I want to go deep, not wide," he explained to the board members who questioned his approach. "I want to actually know the people we're serving. I want to be part of their journey, not just a source of money." The moment this becomes a corporate program with metrics and efficiency measures, it stops being about people and starts being about scale. And scale is what got me into trouble in the first place. Instead, the foundation became known for its intimate approach. They accepted fewer applicants but worked with them more intensively. They required ongoing mentorship, not just initial funding. They facilitated connections not just between the entrepreneurs and business experts, but between the entrepreneurs and each other, creating a community of mutual support. Several of the first cohort of funded entrepreneurs eventually became mentors themselves, creating a virtuous cycle where success was paid forward. Maya, now 26 years old, found herself in the strange position of being both one of the foundation's most visible success stories and one of its most active advisors. She worked with Harrison to develop criteria for identifying promising entrepreneurs, and she contributed her perspective as someone who'd recently walked the path, that these young people were beginning to travel. She understood their anxieties and their dreams in a way that only someone who'd recently been in their situation could. It was also during this period that a subtle but significant shift occurred in Maya and Harrison's relationship. It wasn't romantic. Both of them were clear about this when they began to acknowledge what was happening. But it was intimate in a different way. It was the intimacy of deep mentorship, of genuine respect for each other's minds and spirits, of the kind of connection that can only develop between people who've decided to see each other fully, without pretense or performance. They would meet for breakfast and discuss business ideas and philosophical questions about the meaning of work and success. They would attend conferences together and afterward dissect what they'd learned. They would introduce each other to people and ideas and experiences that expanded their respective worlds. Some people in their circles were puzzled by this friendship that didn't fit neatly into conventional categories. Not quite family, not quite professional colleagues, not quite romantic partners. But those who truly knew them understood that the relationship transcended these categories because it was predicated on something rarer and more valuable. Genuine love predicated not on obligation or attraction, but on the recognition of kindred spirits. Elena, watching this connection develop, was satisfied. "He needed a daughter," she said to Maya one evening when they were cooking together in the kitchen of Lumiere. "Not to replace the ones he has, but because he never understood what it meant to truly see a young person and support their becoming without needing them to become anything in particular. And you needed a mentor who could teach you not just about business, but about holding on to your humanity while you succeed. You teach each other what you both needed to know." 4 years after they'd met, Harrison received a diagnosis that put his mortality into much sharper focus. Pancreatic cancer, caught early, but not early enough. The doctors gave him a range of treatments and a timeline that was depressing but not immediately fatal. He was 72 years old, and he had perhaps 2 or 3 good years if he underwent aggressive treatment, or maybe 6 months to a year if he opted for palliative care and rejection of conventional medicine. He called Maya and Elena and told them plainly the way he'd learned to communicate with them. No softening the truth, no performance of false optimism, just the facts and his feelings about them. "I've lived a good life," he said, "and I've lived a very good life, especially since I met you both. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm more concerned about wasting the time I have left. So I'm going to do whatever medical interventions feel right to me. But I'm also going to be very intentional about how I spend my time." What followed was a period of extraordinary grace. Harrison continued his work with the foundation, But he also took time to connect deeply with his adult children for the first time in his life. His relationships with them had been strained and distant, mediated largely through lawyers during his divorce from their mother. But now, knowing that his time was limited, he initiated conversations about his mistakes, his regrets, his genuine desire to know them better. These conversations didn't magically repair years of absence, but they began a process of healing that continued through his treatment and beyond. He also wrote extensively and beautifully about his journey. These writings were eventually published as a series of essays that were read widely and discussed in business schools, in churches, in philosophy seminars. They were not the writings of a sage or someone who'd figured it all out, but rather the writings of a man genuinely working through the implications of having lived one way and then deciding to live another way. The foundation, which had operated for 5 years and had already transformed the lives of dozens of young entrepreneurs and hundreds of customers and community members served by those entrepreneurs, received an enormous anonymous donation, funds that would allow it to operate for the next 20 years, even without any additional contributions. It took a while to track down that the donation had come from Wells and Associates, the company Harrison had founded and then abandoned. The current CEO, recognizing the alignment between this donation and Harrison's values, had wanted to give back to the foundation that was continuing the work of transformation that Harrison had begun. By the time Harrison's cancer entered its final stages, he'd made peace with dying. He'd experienced enough genuine connection and authentic meaning in the 5 years since he'd given his seat to a tired man on a train, or rather, since a kind young woman had given her seat to him, to feel that his life had been, in its totality, a worthwhile journey. He'd been given a second act, a chance to become who he might have been if he'd learned certain lessons earlier. Not everyone gets that. In his final months, he spent most of his time at Elena's apartment, where she and Maya took turns caring for him. The hospice nurse came daily, but it was Elena and Maya who sat with him through the nights, who helped him take medication, who listened when he wanted to talk and respected his silence when he didn't. Elena cooked foods that matched his declining appetite, and she told him stories about her life, her family, her immigration journey. Maya read to him, poetry mostly, and passages from novels that seemed to speak to the particular landscape of dying and meaning-making and letting go. One evening, a few weeks before the end, Harrison said something that crystallized the whole arc of their connection. They were sitting on Elena's small balcony, watching the neighborhood below, people moving through their evening, cars passing, storefronts glowing. "That first day on the train," he said, his voice thin but still carrying the weight of what he wanted to communicate. "When you gave me your seat, I thought I was tired, because of the burden of carrying my company and my empire and my status. But I was actually tired because my life had become empty, and you showed me that it didn't have to be. You showed me that a life could be full, not of things, but of meaning, of connection, of service, of the small, ordinary gestures that actually constitute the vast majority of what makes existence bearable and beautiful." He paused, gathering energy to continue. "I want you both to know that you saved my life. Not medically. The disease is still here, still doing what it does. But spiritually, existentially, you saved me from dying empty. And that matters more than any amount of time. He reached out and took Elena's hand in one of his, and Maya's hand in the other. "Thank you," he said simply. Harrison Wells died on a Tuesday evening in late October, 5 years and 2 weeks after he'd first encountered Maya on the train. He died with Elena singing softly in Spanish on one side of his bed, and Maya holding his hand on the other. He died knowing that his life had mattered, not because of the empire he'd built or the wealth he'd accumulated, but because of the connections he'd forged in the last chapter of his existence. The memorial service was attended by hundreds of people, business leaders and foundation recipients, neighborhood residents and foundation board members, family and friends, and people whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of transformation. But the service was not a celebration of Harrison Wells, the billionaire, or the businessman. It was a celebration of Harrison Wells, the human being who'd learned to love and be loved, who'd learned that meaning couldn't be purchased, but had to be created through authentic connection and genuine service. In the months following his death, Elena and Maya had to navigate their grief, which was complicated and multi-layered. They grieved the loss of his presence, the conversations that would no longer happen, the future they'd imagined involving his continued involvement in their lives and work. But they also carried the gift of his transformation, the knowledge that his final years had been rich with purpose and connection. His will stipulated that a significant portion of his remaining estate be placed in a permanent endowment for the foundation, ensuring that his work would continue long after he was gone. Maya found herself stepping more fully into a leadership role in the foundation. She worked with Harrison's widow, who had remained on warm terms with him even after their divorce, and who shared his values about using their wealth for good, to ensure that the foundation's mission remained true to Harrison's vision. She continued to run Lumiere, which had expanded to a second location, but maintained the same philosophy of quality and community. She wrote more, became more visible in conversations about entrepreneurship and social equity, and the responsibility that privilege carries. But perhaps most significantly, she carried forward the lesson that Harrison's life had taught her, that true wealth was not measured in money, but in relationships, that the most valuable thing any person could do was show up with genuine presence and attention for others, that a single act of kindness could ripple outward in ways that the person performing the kindness could never fully predict or measure. Elena, now managing her arthritis with a cocktail of medications and physical therapy, became a grandmother-like figure to many of the foundation's recipients. Young entrepreneurs would come to her with problems, and she would listen with the patience of someone who had heard many variations of the same fundamental human struggles: fear of failure, doubt in oneself, the challenge of maintaining integrity in a system that often rewarded compromise. She'd share her own stories, not as prescriptions, but as examples of how people with limited resources and unlimited obstacles could still create meaningful lives through consciousness and intention. The neighborhood where all of this took place began to change in ways that were both remarkable and troubling. As Lumiere became increasingly famous, as the success of the foundation's recipients became visible, as young entrepreneurs opened new businesses and created new employment opportunities, property values began to rise. Longtime residents began to see their rents increase and found themselves unable to afford the neighborhood that had sustained them. This is the paradox of neighborhood revitalization. The very transformation that brings prosperity also brings displacement. Recognizing this danger, Maya and Elena worked with the Foundation's board to develop affordable housing initiatives tied to the Foundation's mission. The Foundation began purchasing properties in the neighborhood and renting them at below-market rates to low-income families. They partnered with community organizations to create programs that would help residents navigate the changes happening around them. It wasn't a complete solution. No single solution could be. But it was an attempt to ensure that the very people who'd been part of creating the neighborhood's renewed vitality wouldn't be pushed out by the prosperity that success had generated. 7 years after meeting Harrison on the train, Maya stood in the dining room of Lumiere during a Foundation gala. The event was meant to celebrate the 100 businesses that had been launched with Foundation support over the previous 5 years. The room was filled with restaurateurs and engineers and healthcare providers and artists and musicians and social entrepreneurs of every description. They were of every race and ethnicity, every age and background. They were people who, now 5, 10, 15 years earlier, had seemed like they might never get the chance to build something of their own. Now they had, and the combined impact of their work was measurable in terms of jobs created, services provided, communities transformed. Maya saw her mother across the room, speaking with a young woman who'd received a grant to start a mental health counseling business focused on serving immigrant communities. Elena was sharing some piece of advice, her weathered hands moving expressively as she spoke. Elena was 73 now, her body marked by years of physical labor and illness. But her spirit remained sharp and generous. She'd taken a grant from the Foundation herself, not for a business, but for a legacy project, documenting the oral histories of the immigrant families in the neighborhood, creating an archive of stories and recipes and traditions that might otherwise be lost. Looking around the room at all these people, the entrepreneurs and the staff of the Foundation, the community members and the mentors, and the young people just beginning their journeys, Maya felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with awareness of responsibility. Harrison's investment in her had multiplied exponentially, not just her own success, but the success of dozens of people she'd mentored, and the impact of their businesses on the thousands of people they served daily. What had started with one act of kindness, a young woman offering her seat to a tired man, had become a transformation that had reached far beyond the three of them. She thought about how close she'd come to never doing that. What if she'd been too tired that evening? What if she'd been selfish? What if she'd noticed the man, but convinced herself that it wasn't her responsibility? The butterfly effect seemed less like a metaphor and more like a description of actual causality. How many of the 100 businesses represented in this room wouldn't exist if she hadn't made that simple choice? But she also knew that her choice, important as it had been, hadn't been the only crucial moment in this chain of events. Harrison had also made a choice, the choice to follow her off the train, the choice to show up at her restaurant, the choice to listen to her story, the choice to fundamentally reorient his priorities and his life. Elena had made choices too, to share her wisdom, to open her home, to work with the Foundation, even when she had every reason to remain cynical about wealthy people claiming to have undergone spiritual transformations. And every one of the 100 entrepreneurs represented in this room had made the choice to believe that they could build something, to accept help without letting that help undermine their autonomy, to do the work. As the evening progressed and people shared stories of how the foundation had impacted their lives, Maya found herself thinking about Harrison and wishing he could be here to see this. But in another way, he was here. His influence lived on in the values that the foundation embodied, in the mentorship model he'd helped develop, in the second chances and the new possibilities that continued to ripple outward. One of the speakers that evening was a young man named Diego, who'd received a grant 6 years earlier to start a solar installation company. He was now one of the most successful businesses the foundation had supported, with 20 employees and contracts throughout the city to install renewable energy systems. Diego told the story of his journey, leaving school at 16 to work construction and support his family, encountering the foundation's program, receiving mentorship that helped him understand that his intelligence and drive could be channeled into something of his own creation. "I thought success meant escaping my neighborhood," Diego said. "But through this program, I learned that success meant building something here, something that my family and my community could be part of. I didn't just want to lift myself up. I wanted to lift up the place where I'm from." After the gala, after the guests had departed and the staff was cleaning up, Maya sat with Elena in a quiet corner of the restaurant. They were both tired, the way that people are tired after hours of emotional engagement and joy. "He would have been proud," Elena said quietly, and Maya knew immediately that she was talking about Harrison. "Yes," Maya agreed, "but he would have also been critical. He would have wanted us to do better, to reach more people, to think bigger, and also more carefully about the long-term impacts of our work." "That's what made him so valuable," Elena said. "He could hold the tension between accepting what we've accomplished and always pushing toward what we could accomplish next. That's a rare quality." Elena reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "You have it too, Mija. I see it in you all the time. And I'm grateful for it, but also I want to remind you not to exhaust yourself the way he did, at least in his early years. Success is a process, not a destination. You'll have time to build more. You don't have to build it all at once." Maya thought about this advice, and she recognized its wisdom. She'd been working at a fever pitch for years now. The restaurant, the foundation, the writing, the speaking engagements, the constant engagement with problems that seemed endlessly expandable. Harrison's life had taught her that the most meaningful work wasn't always the most visible or the most ambitious. Sometimes it was the work of being present, of really showing up for one person. She resolved to make some changes in her own life. She would step back from some of her speaking engagements. She would hire a general manager for the restaurant so that she didn't have to be there every night. She would take time to rest and read and simply be rather than constantly doing. She would tend to her relationships with more intention and less distraction, and she would continue to tell the story of what had happened, how a moment of kindness on a train had transformed her life, and how that transformation had rippled outward to touch the lives of dozens of other people. Not because the story was about her, or even about Harrison, but because it was a story about the fundamental human capacity to change, to choose differently, to recognize that we are all connected, and that our choices matter more than we often realize. In the years that followed, Lumiere became an institution in the neighborhood, a place that was genuinely loved by the people who frequented it. Maya mentored young chefs and hospitality professionals, passing on the lessons she'd learned from her mother and from Harrison. The foundation continued its work, funding more businesses, supporting more entrepreneurs, reaching deeper into the question of what it meant to create economic opportunity for people who'd been systematically excluded from it. Elena eventually stepped down from her formal role with the foundation, but she continued to work informally as a kind of elder advisor, the person that struggling entrepreneurs would come to talk to when they hit rough patches. She never charged for this work. She did it because she believed in it, because she understood that her hard-won wisdom was valuable precisely because it had been earned through struggle and survival. Years turned into decades. Maya, now in her 40s, had become a recognized voice in conversations about economic justice and entrepreneurship. She'd written another book, this one focusing on the lives and businesses of the foundation's recipients. She'd been named to several prestigious boards and had been offered substantial positions in larger organizations, but she'd consistently chosen to remain rooted in her neighborhood, in the work she'd created, in the community that had shaped her. Elena lived to be 91 years old, surrounded by grandchildren, both biological and adopted, and great-grandchildren, and the dozens of young people who'd been mentored by her through the foundation. When she died, the memorial service was attended by hundreds of people who came to honor her life and testify to her impact. Stories emerged of her quiet wisdom, her patience, her ability to see potential in people that others had given up on. After Elena's death, Maya established the Elena Flores Memorial Fund within the foundation, specifically designed to support mentorship and elder wisdom in the entrepreneurship space. The fund recognized the reality that successful businesses were built not just through capital and business acumen, but through the transfer of wisdom from people who'd lived through struggle to people who were currently struggling. It was a way of making formal and institutionalizing something that Elena had done informally her entire life. On the 25th anniversary of the day that Maya had given her seat to Harrison on the train, a documentary filmmaker who was working on a film about the foundation approached her about telling the story. At first, Maya was hesitant. The story felt almost too neat, too much like the kind of inspirational narrative that could lead to oversimplification. But the filmmaker was thoughtful and rigorous, and she promised to tell the story in all its complexity, not as a simple tale of one person's kindness transforming another person's life, but as an exploration of how connection and intention and choice ripple outward across time and space. The documentary, titled Light from the Train, premiered at a major film festival to critical acclaim. It told the story not just from Maya's perspective, but from Harrison's, from Elena's, from the various entrepreneurs who'd been part of the foundation's work. It explored the paradoxes and contradictions inherent in the work of social change. It didn't shy away from the challenges of gentrification or the limitations of philanthropic approaches to systemic inequality. But it also captured something true about human possibility, the reality that individuals could choose differently, that moments of connection mattered, that ripple effects were real and powerful. The film sparked renewed interest in the foundation and in the neighborhood where Lumiere was located. But more importantly, it sparked conversations about the nature of transformation and how change happened, not through grand gestures or top-down approaches, but through the accumulated choices of individuals to act with generosity and intention, to see each other fully, to believe that another world was possible, and to take action consistent with that belief. Maya, watching herself on screen at the premiere of the documentary, felt a complicated mix of emotions. There was some discomfort at being so visible, at having her private transformation made public. But there was also a sense of rightness, because the story wasn't really about her. It was about all of us, about the human capacity to change and to help each other change. It was about the ways that simple acts of kindness could have consequences that extend far beyond what we could ever predict or measure. After the premiere, she sat for an interview with the director of the film, and when asked what she'd learned from her journey with Harrison and her work with the foundation, she answered carefully, "I think the most important thing I've learned is that transformation is possible, but it requires us to be brave enough to be vulnerable, to admit what we don't know, to accept help, and to offer help without keeping score." Harrison could have lived his entire life as a successful businessman without ever changing. I could have walked past him that day on the train without seeing him. Elena could have remained private about her wisdom instead of sharing it with so many people. But we all made different choices, and those choices mattered. She paused and then added, "But I also think it's important to acknowledge that this story is a story of particular people, in particular circumstances, with particular advantages and disadvantages. Not everyone has the possibility of meeting a billionaire who's ready to transform. Not everyone has the luxury of taking time to mentor others. Not everyone has the wisdom to know what to do with their good fortune. So while I believe this story is inspiring and true, I also believe we need to be careful about treating it as a blueprint. Real social change requires systemic transformation, not just individual acts of kindness. But individual acts of kindness, done repeatedly and collectively, can be part of how we create the conditions for systemic transformation. It's both and, not either or. In her final years, Maya used her platform and her resources to focus increasingly on advocacy for policy changes that would support small entrepreneurs, particularly those from marginalized communities. She worked with policymakers on legislation around access to capital, on workplace protections, on affordable housing policy. She recognized that while the foundation had been able to help hundreds of people build businesses, there were thousands more who had similar potential, but lacked access to those opportunities. Systemic change, she came to understand, was necessary alongside individual transformation. The work continued: the restaurant, the foundation, the mentorship, the storytelling. Maya aged, as all humans do, and eventually she too would pass the work to others. But the legacy that she and Harrison and Elena had created together would continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways that none of them could have predicted. On that ordinary evening when a tired man sat down in a seat that a kind young woman had offered to him on a train. And perhaps that's the ultimate message of the story, that we are all interconnected, that our choices matter more than we know, that a single moment of genuine kindness can cascade through time and space in ways that transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. That the most powerful change doesn't come from the top down, but bubbles up from the ground level, from people choosing to see each other, to help each other, to believe that another way of being is possible. We are all on that train together, moving through our city, our country, our world. Every day we make choices about whether to see each other, to help each other, or to remain locked in our own preoccupations. Every day we have the opportunity to offer our seat, not out of obligation, but out of genuine recognition that we are all carrying something heavy, all struggling with something, all in need of kindness and connection. And every time we make that choice to show up with compassion, to listen with real attention, to help without keeping score, we change the trajectory of the world in ways we may never fully understand, but that matter more than almost anything else. This is the story of one train ride, one act of kindness, one moment that changed everything. But it's also the story of all of us, of the infinite human potential for connection and transformation that exists in every moment, waiting only for us to notice it and choose to act on it. The question is not whether our choices matter. They absolutely do. The question is what we're going to do with that knowledge, how we're going to live our lives in light of understanding that we are all connected, that our actions ripple outward, that we have more power to create change than we ever realized. The choice always is ours.